Okay, so an important notice and the disclaimer. This presentation is based on the information available to AEMO from the 5th of September. So please do not take this as advice. You need to verify any information we provide you today and take a moment to look over this disclaimer. We have sent around the slides, and like I said, we'll publish the recording on the internet. Now, today is going to have a meeting protocol. AEMO is going to be complying with the Competition and Consumer Act. We do not want any cartel conduct today, no concerted practices. You can see the list here. So we don't want any arrangements or anything that could lessen competition, and we obviously don't want any use of market power to lessen competition. So yeah, please take a moment to have a look over this slide. The next slide will also go through a bit of the meeting protocol. Okay, so just a reminder to the people that have joined late, this session will be recorded. If you do not want to be recorded, please don't attend. We'll publish this recording on our website on the where we publish the RERT tenders. And also please post your questions in the chat box so Hayley can coordinate those at the end of the presentation. So now, please do not share any competitively sensitive information in this meeting. We're only here to discuss the topics that are being presented regarding the interim reliability reserves. If you have any objections, please stop the conversation, raise any concerns, and so make sure you're familiar with this protocol, and stop the meeting if you have any issues. Okay, getting into it. Interim reliability reserves. So interim reliability reserves, or interim reserves, are very similar to the long notice RERT mechanism, except that it's on a temporary basis. And so the trigger point is lower than the long notice RERT program, so the interim reliability measure is setting that trigger point for the interim reliability reserves. And that's at 0.0006 of unserved energy. So like long notice RERT, the interim reserves can pay availability payments. We can also pay pre-activation and activation payments. We can also enter into interim reserve contracts for longer than 12 months, which is up to 3 years. Okay, so what is the need for the interim reliability reserves? So this year in the 2023 ESU, we've forecast unserved energy to be above this interim reliability measure. And so that has triggered the interim reliability reserve mechanism. So the RERT guidelines say that we should not be relying on the short notice RERT program in this case. So hence we've published the interim reliability reserve tender. You can see in this table here, we've got a gap of 118 megawatts declared in South Australia for this financial year. And in Victoria, it's 120 megawatts. And this is the first time we've triggered the interim reserve process. And so under the rules, we can procure how much we consider reasonably necessary to address those gaps just mentioned. So we could procure more than that if needed. However, we'll be explaining why we would need to procure more in our quarterly report. And this could be to cover certain periods of availability, or it could be to address operational requirements such as, the max run times. Either way, we're going to have to go to the SA and Victorian governments and seek approval for the contracts we're going to enter into. And so we'll have to be sharing with them the expected costs and the megawatts relevant to their jurisdictions.
Sorry,
Ben.
Yep.
Sorry, John. I was going to say, Ron has his hand up. Maybe he had a question about that previous slide.
Yes, thanks. Actually, it was the slide before that I had the question about. When you referred to the RERT guidelines and the process that, yes, you should use the long notice RERT tendering component, that section in the guideline refers to how you should call for tenders and that you shouldn't rely on using the RERT panel for when you have notice greater than the 12 weeks. So I just wanted to correct you in the way you expressed the requirement in the guideline. You expressed it as you had to contract for long notice RERT. That's not my understanding of the rules or of the guideline from reading the going back and looking at the paper under which the guideline was set. That provision applies only to the tendering. There's no obligation on AEMO at the time to sign a long notice RERT contract. That's your decision. Also, unlike the clauses in Chapter 3, where AEMO must meet reliability for an exceedance of the reliability standard, 11.128, which is the provisions for the interim reliability reserves, it only says that you may, not that you must. So
Yeah,
I think they're important distinctions to understand in that, yes, you should tender under the provisions of the long notice RERT, and I wholly agree with that. But I don't think there's any obligation on you to sign a contract per se. You could hold that contract in abeyance until such time it's determined that it's needed. Only just the only requirement is that your tendering process, when there's sufficiently long notice, should be to get other than just a RERT panel membership pricing. So I just wanted to raise that with you because they're very important issues that thus far you don't seem to have addressed.
Yeah,
and the reason I'm raising it is lining up and signing RERT contracts, particularly ones that are long notice that go for many years and have availability payments, that can result in a significant cost to consumers and may deliver little benefit. So they're just some points that that I think need to be said and some that you should be aware of. And I noticed James was nodding his head and saying, yeah, Ron's got it right. I just want to impress the fact that the rules actually don't require you to sign a long notice RERT or a multi-year RERT contract. That decision is entirely up to AEMO.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Thanks for raising those points. We would appreciate the feedback, and if you could put any further comments in the chat, we're going to have Hayley coordinate the comments and questions at the end. So, but yeah, appreciate the feedback. So this slide here is about the reporting. So we're going to have to report within 1 month of entering any reserve contracts, the names of who we've signed up with and the volumes and the timing of those reserves procured. This is similar to what we do with short notice RERT. Following any activations, we'll also need to report on the estimated payments within 5 business days. And we have to provide the AMC with the bid data of all the offers received under this procurement process. We also will be reporting on in the interim, the quarterly report, and that's due in May. So we'll report all the more details in that. Okay, so who's eligible and who's the tender open to? So we're seeking reserves over 10 megawatts in Victoria and South Australia. We have published a questions and answers document. So there has been some questions around, can people offer less than 10 megawatts? And the answer is yes. And so technically that wouldn't be a conforming offer, but we can still review those offers. The reserves must be able to be provided for more than an hour. And we're looking at load reduction or generation increase. And so if you are offering a generation increase, there is particular schedules in the contract that will relate to that. So Schedule 1 and Schedule 2. The reason why there's 2 different schedules related to generation increase is because there's one for scheduled generation and then there's one for unscheduled generation. The 3rd schedule in the template contract relates to load reduction. The next point is about out of market. So AEMO is required to make sure we take the actions that have the least distortionary effect on the market. And so our evaluations will assess that. And so the guidelines, talk about we can make reasonable inquiries into the market, assess any information available to AEMO that's relevant. So for example, we can look at the NIMIs, review the NIMI data and do our comparisons there. Out of market reserves essentially means we would not have the reserves would not have otherwise been offered load reduction or generation increase at any point during the reserve period. And so that reserve period is the length that we're going to be paying the availability payments for potentially, if that's how the offers come through. And so anything that is being offered has to remain out of market for that period as well. So obviously, unless it's been activated for interim reserve contracts. And again, it can be scheduled or unscheduled. So it says subject to no requirements there. So for example, a scheduled asset would have to be out of market for 12 months. So there's different requirements there that we'll have to assess. So the reserve period. So when do we want these reserves? So we're going to have to evaluate the different months that the reserve has been offered. In the tender, there's a section on the different reserve blocks you can potentially offer and the different periods you can offer them for. So you can have some flexibility and give AEMO the optionality there. And then we can assess if they're available in the key months of December, January, February, March. The ESU highlights some trading intervals over when it's expected the reserves would be needed. So for example, on weekdays between 5 and 9 p.m. in SA and 3 p.m. to 9 p.m. in Victoria. And so we're hoping that the tender's got that flexibility in there so you can offer the various options so we can procure them, if needed, the most optimal reserves. If you can offer reserve, in the tender documents, we've said our expected service commencement date is the 1st of January 2024. The reserves can be offered earlier than this, and we've published that in our Q&A document. And so if the reserves can be provided earlier, then we can potentially contract earlier, but our expected service commencement date is, the 1st of January next year. And that is in part to allow for any potential testing. And also we understand that it can take a while to sign up and negotiate contracts and implement any equipment or processes that might be needed on the provider's end. Interim reliability reserve usage example. So this is essentially pulled from our short notice RERT process, and it aligns with the current process we've got on our procedure that's published on the internet. And so you can see here we've clouded this section, invitation to tender. And so it's essentially showing what's different between the existing short notice RERT process and the process to trigger interim reserves. And so the interim reserves have been contracted before the event, where in short notice RERT, we have a competitive process on the day, and then that results in the tender on the day. And so the interim reserve process excludes that tender on the day step. So essentially, you can still have the pre-activation notice, but that warning, the activation notice is the actual signal to decrease load or increase generation. So those two steps would remain, and AEMO would still take the same processes as preparing to use reserves, where we would assess a number of factors of the different options. So we could look in saying, what's the lead time of all the reserves we've got available, and use the least cost first. So this could be comparing other short notice providers that are available in the day or are not. But also, obviously, before we're even getting to this RERT stage, we're going to be going through our normal processes of looking at outage assessments and moving outages if possible, looking at the other steps on the process for improving reserves on the grid. So that doesn't include, this slide doesn't include that. The next thing on this slide shows that these times are customizable. So in your offer, you can put how many hours or minutes it would take for you to be activated or pre-activated. The terminology does change a little bit for generation. It's, I think, called enablement instead of activation, but it's a similar concept. And you don't actually have to have this pre-activation step. So that can be 0 and just can straight go into activation. We don't expect to send deactivation instructions unless they're required to alter what was activated or in those activation notices, and reserves can potentially run over if required because of the minimum run times. Okay, so availability. So the interim reserve program, we're expecting reserves to be available every day for the reserve period that they've offered and ended up potentially being contracted for. So that is different to the short notice RERT program, for example, where there is no requirement to be available and you get paid for being used on the day if you were available. And so we'll go over the availability of payments a bit in a sec in the next slide. But there is a function in the market portal where reserve providers can log in and declare their availability. So we expect that you'd be able to log in and do that declaration. You may not have to actually log in every day and declare, but we'd expect that you'd at least have the capability to be confirming your availability and understanding your availability on that daily basis, because you won't be paid for days that you're unavailable. And I'll jump to that next slide. So in terms of the payments, you don't have to have availability payments, obviously, but that is a function of this program. And you can obviously still then have the other payments for pre-activation or activation. But the key difference is, or the key thing to note is that there is an adjustment process or an adjustment methodology in the proposed contracts. So if the reserves are called upon and they were not available, then there's a potential that the payments that have already been paid may need to be adjusted and could be potentially reduced from an effective date of amendment. And this is a little example here. And so what that means is that potentially, if you weren't able to provide, let's say in this example, 10 megawatts, but 8 megawatts was provided, then the effective amendment date could be the commencement of the service, or it could be the last date that the test was completed, for example, and then payments could be then reduced, backdated to those dates. Okay, so what's the timing and next steps? And so we have the tender documents published on our website, so please go have a look at the tender form to be filled out, have a look at the contract to be filled out, noting the different schedules there. The deadline for your questions is the 22nd of September, and so please get your questions in by that date. You can send them in writing to our RERT email addresses, which is on our website. The tenders then close 5 p.m. Melbourne time on the 30th of September. Please get them in on time. Late tenders may be excluded. And that's all we really have to present today. And so we can go over and have a bit of a Q&A if there's any questions. And so, yeah, over to Hayley.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. There's no questions as such at the moment.
Cool.
Just a note from Ron, which I can share. So section 6.2 of the reliability panel. Oh, hang on, it disappeared. I've just got another one. Hang on. Section 6.2 of the Reliability Panel RERT Guidelines indicate that AEMO should not rely exclusively on a RERT panel where time allows for a more formal tendering process for RERT provision. This relates to the tendering process, not the requirement to only contract for long notice or interim reliability reserves. AEMO may still determine whether or not to do that.
I was just putting in writing what I said before, so that you had it there in writing for you.
Yep. No worries. Thanks for that, Ron. I have noted that down. Oh, and your next comment too also.
Similar.
Yep. Yeah, but there's no other comments or questions in the chat at this stage.
Yeah, and it's a good point.
Here's one. Sorry, here's one. What is the expected USE for VIC and SA?
Yeah, it's and so just before I jump onto that one, I did want to go back to there was a slide that said that we get approvals from the SA and VIC government or the jurisdictions. And I think it did mention that, contracts may not be approved if their expected costs exceed alternatives, such as short notice RERT. So that's probably a good point. Also for this demonstration here, like Ron's saying, we do compare all available reserves. And so this is obviously an example on the day, but that doesn't necessarily mean the interim reserves would be used before a short notice. We obviously want to use what's least cost. what's the expected unserved energy for Vic NSA? So we have put in a table, I believe you're here, expected unserved energy for the gap period. And so, yeah, you can see the gigawatt hours on that slide there. So it's not a huge amount, thankfully. It is good to know.
I think it's worth noting, Ben, that whilst those expected USC for the gap period are there in gigawatt hours, whilst they exceed the interim reliability measure, they fall short of the reliability standards.
Yep.
And we've got a hand up, Ben. Jackie, would you like to raise your question?
Thanks, Haley. Ben, you said that this load can't be offered in any other form. So if you're in short notice RERT, you're looking for alternate loads to short notice. Is that correct?
Yeah, and so if you're the same reserve would have to be pulled out of short notice to be put into interim. So you can currently be a short notice RERT provider, and it can be offered into short notice RERT and interim reserves. But if we accepted the interim reserve contract for that, you would then have to pull it out for the short notice program for the period in which it's in the interim reserve contract. So it couldn't be in both programs at once.
Okay, so if you didn't have availability payments for the interim reserve, are you still in the contract? Are you still in the interim reserve contract, or is it like short notice?
So let's say, for example, you have a site and it's, I don't know, 10 megawatts because that's the minimum, and it's currently in short notice RERT and it's got 1 NIMI, and you offer that also into the interim reserve tender, and let's say we accept it for the months of, January, February, March, let's say. And then so for those months, you could pull it out of the short notice RERT program, and then it would be getting potentially paid availability payments for those 3 months. And then at the end of those 3 months, when it's no longer in the interim reserve, you could then put it back into short notice, where we could then call on it again for short notice. And the availability payments would obviously stop.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for clarifying.
Thank you, Jackie. Next question, Ben, for a multi-year contract, would the volume be capped by size of the gap in the second year?
I think that's a tough one. So you're saying the gap of the megawatts here, so we'd be limited to 55 here. I think it would apply, the same slide would apply, which is this next one. So the amounts we procure don't necessarily have to be exactly the same as those numbers forecast, but we have to explain why we're going over or under in the quarterly reports. And it could be for operation requirements different, or but I think the principles in the rules to me basically indicate that we're going to be doing what's the lowest cost. And so then all offers have to include the first year, and then may include subsequent years, and they may be at discounts and whatnot. So we'll review those at the time.
Thanks, Ben. I have no more questions for you at the moment from the chat. If anyone wants to put their hand up or come off mute and ask any questions. Nothing heard. Hang on. Alan, you have a hand up.
Thanks, Haley. Hey, Ben, just a quick one for you, and I think I already know the answer to this, but I might as well ask it anyway because there's no other questions coming up. The capacity has to be within either South Australia or Victoria, correct?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we have put that in the Q&A. We have said that they do have to be in South Australia, Victoria. However, we could use reserves that are offered for SA for Victoria, or vice versa. So that will depend on factors like what we expect to be available on the interconnector at the time of when the reserves are offered and things like that. So, yeah, they have to be in either of those regions, but we could combine the offers together or have some diversity there.
Understood. Thanks, Ben.
Sorry, Ben, can I ask why that is? Why is it in, sorry, I should put my hand up, but Declan from Flow Power. I'm just wondering why that is. Why can reserves be shared over the big SA interconnector and not the New South Wales big interconnector? Is it like coincident peak demand or something in SA and Vic?
Yeah, I think it's I think the situation between VIC and SA is very different in terms of how the interconnector flows work, and I'm not an expert on how that works, but the yeah, I'm not sure if Johnny or James want to jump in there, but it's
Ben, it's John Logan. I can give you a bit of help there. The unserved energy recorded in VIC and SA would be on the assumption that if the VNI, the Victorian and New South Wales, or even Basslink, has to be, could help to reduce the level of USC, it would have already done so. So the only way that this USC can be reduced and the gap reduced is by generation in either VIC or SA. And because I'd say the assumption behind the VIC and SA USC is sharing of USC between the two regions. So by having it in either VIC or SA, it doesn't matter, it's going to reduce the level of USC. But the other states, it's already assumed that the interconnectors are maxed out in the modelling.
Cool. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Ron.
Ben, one thing that concerns me, and I agree with what you said about the stuff being able to come out of the short notice route to go into the long notice route, but that to me seems to be an inefficient outcome, in that all we're doing is replacing short notice route, which would not have availability payments associated with it, with long notice route that does. That just doesn't seem to be an efficient outcome.
Yeah, we have had lots of obviously interest in this interim reserve program, and so it could be that reserves are not already in short notice. There could be new unused reserves that are into the program because they needed availability payments because there was more cost associated with it. If there is short notice for it that's moved into that interim reserve contract, it could actually be at a lower cost or more competitive, and the SA and the governments will have to make those assessments over like approving of any cost of anything that does move between programs. But also you'd get better reliability because of that availability payments, because right now the short notice route program providers, and a lot of them actually like this, do not have to be available at all because they're running a business or whatever it is, so they don't want to have to always be worrying about the energy market. And so if we actually need them to be available, then we have to potentially pay an availability to make that availability more reliable, so they actually have someone ready to turn off instead of just at a whim if they're available or not. The short notice route program is very much opt-in on the day. So, we might call them up and they say, oh, I'm not at the office today, so we're unavailable,
Thanks, Ben, and thank you, Ron. I have nothing else in the chat and no more hands up, so if there's any...
Oh, sorry, I was on mute then. I was just going to say to Ben that yes, he could be correct, but it should be noted that just like short notice route, long notice route allows someone to say, I'm sorry, I'm not available today due to such and such, and they just lose their daily availability payment. So yes, it could result in firmer route, but there's no guarantee per se that it would achieve that outcome.
Thanks.
Thank you, Ron. Well, if there's no other takers, I was just going to hand it back to Ben to close the meeting.
Yeah, no, thank you everyone for coming. Please, send through any other questions before that deadline I mentioned. I think it was Friday the 22nd. Other than that, we're looking forward to seeing the tender responses come through on the 30th of September. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Hayley.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks all.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Ron. Thanks, Mark. Still recording, so just make sure everyone leaves the meeting. You're on mute. Yeah,
Yeah,
we're
I
still
was just-
obviously recording. So
You know, I understand. That's why I was just making sure everyone left, because sometimes people wander off and do something else. And
yeah,
I had
I
a
don't
meeting
want
once
people
that kept recording for an hour and 49 minutes after it was closed.
oh no,
Someone was still on there.
yeah,
I know
Sam.
Tom or Peter or Samantha, if you're there. Samantha's there.
I'm here.
Yeah, so
Yes.
please leave the meeting because it's
Okay.
recording.
Sure.
I think I can remove people here. I can remove them as well.
All right. Good job. See you.
Thanks, Mark.